There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn of Shawn Breathes Books, and I am here for a very special chat with a very special writer. This is Christopher DiRaddo, a gay Italian-Canadian writer from Montreal, and I have read every book he's ever written, all two of them,
All
and
two
I've
of them, yeah.
loved them both passionately, and here I am to chat with Christopher about them. Christopher, welcome back to my channel.
Hi, Shawn. Thanks for having me on the show.
Both of these books were published by the imprint Esplanade Books, which is the fiction imprint of Vehicule Press. And his debut, The Geography of Pluto, was originally published 2014 and then reissued in 2022. And his second novel, The Family Way, was published in 2021. I read The Geography of Pluto a couple of years ago, I think, a year and a half ago, and I did a review and it caught Christopher's attention, and that's how we got in touch. And then I started reading his second novel shortly thereafter, The Family Way, and it was not a slow read. It was like as slow as molasses read, but oh boy, what a wonderful reading experience it was. So now that I've finished both books, we're here to chat about them. Tell us about what's the opening premise of The Geography of Pluto?
Yeah, so The Geography of Pluto, it's my first book. It took me a long time to write. It took me about 14 years. Okay, and I think, at the time, I wasn't really sure what the story was. I think when I set out to tell it, I think, it was like a lot of young writers, I just knew that I wanted to be a writer. Around the time that I had my first heartbreak, the first time I fell in love with a man and kind of like had that end, I was really unprepared for how I felt afterwards. And so I ended up doing a lot of writing. I did a lot of reflecting a bit about what that relationship was like, what it meant to me, what it meant for my past, what it meant for my future. And that whole writing exercise became the basis for the book. I wanted to explore what it means to fall in love, have your heart broken, and then try to come back from that. So that's how it started. It got me thinking in many ways about first loves in a gay man's life. The first time we fall in love with another man, it's significant. But there are other first loves as well. And like, for me, I can speak about my relationship with my mother. Like I'm totally a mama's boy. I think a lot of gay men are. And in ways, my mom was my first love. She was the one that I was, making dinner for, and I was the one watching movies with. And I found that when I met someone that I wanted to be with, that relationship took a back seat a little bit. My relationship with my mom, I didn't see her as much because I was pursuing this other relationship. And the whole thing got me thinking about these loves that are in our lives and whether they're, loves that we're born into that are, part of our family, or whether they're loves that we find. And so I really enjoyed taking both relationships, my main character Will, taking both of his relationships and contrasting them against each other.
Now, the setting of this is around 2006, I believe.
After 2000s, the early 2000s, I would say yes.
The reason I was able to pin it down to being around 2006 was, like you just said, that was when Pluto got demoted. And the title of your novel is The Geography of Pluto.
Yeah.
What's that about? Without
Well,
going into anything spoilery.
yeah, the title came late in the process, actually. Like sometimes with books, like, you have a working title and then you end up with one. I decided to make Will a geography teacher. He's a high school
Mhm.
geography teacher, so he's very much interested in this notion of mapping spaces. And when you read it, you kind of see that you're experiencing his geography as well. So, he lives in Montreal, and you see his emotional geography. So he's kind of charting a little bit, how he feels in the wake of certain events and activities in his life, things that happen to him. So like as this like geographer, like, so he's very much kind of interested in that. And so I play a lot with metaphor and looking at the ideas of exploration, of tracking your progress in life. And Pluto just arrived a little bit as like a gift at some point while writing this book. It did get downgraded as a planet, and I remember thinking, wow, it's just almost this like loss of innocence a little bit. It's like just something that you've been taught your entire life is one thing, and then all of a sudden you realize it's another, And I started to play around a little bit with this notion of Pluto and researching into it. And Pluto itself is it's such a transformational planet, like in terms of when we look at our solar system, it's the one that's It's the farthest out there. At the time that I was writing it, we hadn't explored it. Like, we had sent a shuttle to, or a satellite to go take photographs of it. At the time, it was the only planet in our solar system that hadn't been photographed. And so to me, it really represented the unknown, the great unknown, this desire that a lot of explorers have to discover the great unknown. And Pluto is a Roman god. He's also the god of the underworld. He's the god of Hades. He's the god of death and also rebirth. In the Roman mythology, Pluto's powers are transformative. And so the fact that the book was dealing with loss and it was dealing with like endings, to me, it felt like, Pluto just felt like also this natural metaphor for so much of the book. And again, like, we can't plan this, like a lot of times with writers, we don't really know. We're just writing in the dark. We're writing towards maybe a light that we see in the dark, in the far off distance. And when it arrived, it just like what just it just fit right into it, and I knew that it was meant to be. So it felt like an important part of the story that I wanted to tell.
Well, and now that you've explained a bunch of things that didn't occur to me, I want to go home, reread the book. That's, that's fabulous. So tell us about the protagonist, Will. He's 27 and he's been recently dumped by his boyfriend, Max. What else do you want to say about Will?
Yeah, so his mother is a single mom. He grew up without a father. His father died when he was very young, and he grew up in the Plateau, which is one of the neighborhoods here in Montreal. He's gay, like I am. Like discovered his sexuality at a young age, and then trying to figure out what his place in the world will be. What kind of relationship will he have? Because he sees his mother, who's a single woman who never remarried, who in many ways is still grieving the loss of her husband, and he sees her life as a bit of a lonely life. She's also a woman who's in remission from cancer. She's someone who has had her own kind of brush with mortality herself. And, I think for him, he is looking for connection. He's looking to find out who's going to be the people in his family. Family is something that I'm quite interested in a lot of my books. And the character of Will, I think, well, it's very much like me too. I think, when I think back to myself at that time in my life when I was in my mid 20s, I think I was around, 27. You're at that age all of a sudden where you realize like, oh, I'm getting older and I've been having fun going out and meeting new people and going to bars and dancing, but what does my future look like? Am I going to have a family, and will I have a partner and will I settle down? And so a lot of these insecurities and a lot of these questions is able to bake into the character of Will.
Well baked indeed. I related so much to Will. He reminded me so much of myself at that age. He reminded me so much of myself at the age of 47. But I
Yeah,
adored him. And if you don't mind, I'd like you to read
sure.
it's a flashback scene of when he first met his now ex-boyfriend, Max. If you could read
Yeah.
that short scene.
I just want to say prefaces. So this is set in Montreal, and maybe some of your listeners, watchers, viewers don't know, but Montreal is a very bilingual city. We have English and French living side by side here. I've had French boyfriends. We sometimes we speak in English and French, and so Max is a francophone, and Will is an anglophone. So just to kind of give that bit of a background. I met Max in October 2004 at a Halloween party in Mile End. I had stumbled in late along with Angie, Carol, and Izzo. We had been to a screening of the Rocky Horror Picture Show at the Rialto, rice buried deep in our hair. Angie and I had gone as two Transylvanian partygoers, dressed up in matching suits with funny eyewear and pointed party hats. Are you one of the Pet Shop Boys? A handsome man in a plaid shirt asked me out of nowhere. He was dressed as a cowboy, curly blonde wig under a cheap straw hat, and a flower-shaped gift tag around his right wrist that spelled out, "For Harold." No, I said, taking a look at what I was wearing, but I suppose I could be. My friend and I are transvestites from the planet Transsexual Transylvania, the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Of course, the cowboy said. Were you at a screening? I removed my hat and rubbed my scalp to answer his question, grains of rice raining onto the floor. He laughed. It must have been wild. It was, I said, putting the hat back on. I took the tag around his wrist in my hand and looked it over. For Harold, the cowboy from the boys in the band. Very good, he said, impressed. Almost no one I know has seen it. Well, it's not the most upbeat of films, I said. Still, that doesn't mean it can't be great. Some of the best stories are tragic ones. I think The Boys in the Band is my favorite movie. I've seen it like 100 times. Really, I said. A francophone whose favorite film is Boys in the Band, I said with a nod. I think I like that. He smiled and took a swig from his beer, a handsome ranch had taken 5. So you can tell that I'm a francophone. You have a bit of an accent, I said. Damn, he said, looking down. I was hoping it wasn't noticeable. I've been auditioning in English. An actor. It's slight, I said to ease his worry. Hardly noticeable, adorable even. He smiled again, and so did I. Suddenly, I felt something under my foot. A grain of rice had made its way down into the sole of my shoe. Hold on, I said, taking off my sneaker and removing the offending crumb. God, I'm just covered in rice. Don't worry, he said. I'm sure they'll all come falling out once you get home and take off your clothes. I lost my balance putting my shoe back on. What the cowboy had said had sent a silent surge throughout my body. He had undressed me in a sentence, and it felt like I had fallen 10 feet. I'm Max, he said, extending the hand with the gift tag on it. Hi, Max, I said, shaking back. I'm Harold.
And just for the people who haven't read the book, that is not our protagonist's name.
No, it is Will. He's suggesting himself as the present, I guess, or the person
I'm
who's
Harold. You're right. I didn't catch that. That's great.
yeah.
Just a quintessentially Christopher DiRaddo passage. There's humor and sexiness and so much more going on there. Adorable indeed. And how many times have you seen The Boys in the Band? I think I've seen
Oh,
it at least 100.
yeah, I've seen it many,
Uh,
many times. I remember seeing it for the first time on a date with someone, and it was such a buzzkill. Like I remember just being there, like, and he was showing it to me because this is my favorite movie. I want you to experience it. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like there's so much sadness, there's so much trauma in these men's lives. But with time, it's become one of my favorites as well. I was on Broadway a number of years ago, the remake, and I actually went with my partner and some friends. We went down to go see it. So it's just such an important film and sorry, a film and then also play. I recommend, yeah, people checking it out if you haven't. Yeah.
Absolutely. It got to a point where my circle of gay friends, when we were all kind of still living in the same city, they said, "No, we don't have to watch it again. Shawn, just recite it for us."
Yeah.
So Max is almost like a ghost in the novel, in that Will is preoccupied, really deeply focused on recovering from their breakup and remembering their relationship. And so that is a central part of the story alongside his relationship with his mother. Getting back to his mother, their relationship reminds me of a lot of my gay male friends' relationships with their parents, where they were out to them, and this is back in the 80s and 90s. This book is set in the 2000s. They were out to the parents, and they weren't outright rejected, but it was not a comfortable topic to discuss. So there was still a kind of sense of a closetedness and discomfort with really talking about what was really going on in the queer kid's life.
I think, sometimes in books or films, there's kind of either one or the other. You've got parents who are so accepting that they're running up and they're hugging the person's partner, or it's the opposite where people get shunned from their home. But I think a lot of us do live in that middle ground that you were saying, where it's like, our parents, they love us, but they don't necessarily understand us. And if we don't have necessarily a partner that we bring home every Sunday for dinner, our lives also become this like mystery, right? And I think we live in this kind of like unspoken place where it's just we understand, we know, we accept it, but at the same time, probably not going to have the same kind of conversations that like my brother might have about his wife or his girlfriend or something like that. So I wanted to touch upon that because like they obviously really love each other, but at the same time, they don't know how to talk about important things. They know how to talk about what they had for dinner or what they watched on TV. There's a closeness there. That they love each other, but at the same time, some of these important things, these things that people feel very fragile about, or maybe kind of not really sure. You share that with your friends necessarily. You don't necessarily share that with your family, with your parents. And so I wanted that to be the case for Will. Like I want him to want to have a closer relationship with his mom. But in order to do that, sometimes you need to have those hard conversations and you need to make it uncomfortable and you have to make it maybe, a little bit awkward before it becomes quote unquote normalized. It becomes like just part of like everyday conversation.
Absolutely. And without giving anything away, there is a really quite poignant arc to that relationship in the novel. And who is Angie?
Oh, Angie. So I was kind of raised by lesbians, if you could kind of say that in the 90s in Montreal, because like when I came out, most of my really good friends were queer women. I did not connect so much with gay men so much at the beginning. I wasn't meeting necessarily the people who were good for me. I would just say, or had my back, but the women that I met did, and I ended up hanging out with a lot of them and I really love this idea of, I think women are very important in queer men's lives, and I wanted to honor that relationship as well. So Will does have a best friend named Angie who is, I joke about this a lot, like she's more like a gay guy than he is, and he's more like of a
Yes,
lesbian than she is, right?
yes.
So they kind of work really well together. I've had a lot of friends like her, so she's a bit of amalgamation of a bunch of people that I've known in my life who are really intense and fall in love really hard, and someone like Will who's really trying to get over this Max person, someone like Angie can't really understand why someone like Will isn't just out there trying to forget him. And so she was a lot of fun to write. She's a fun character, and I kind of want to write a short story with her at some point, I think, too, because she was just a lot of fun to write, and I do miss her.
That's wonderful. She was a lot of fun to read as well. So my memory of her was that it was like a 2 week cycle. She would kind of
Yeah.
rebound into another relationship
Yes.
and then break up
Yeah.
and so Will is a bit adrift. That's the word I would use. But in the most endearing of ways, I absolutely adored him and his confusion when faced with queer life at that time, clubbing life, the sexual options that were available to him and fueled by lots of heavy drinking and so on. There was absolutely no judgment in the way that you portrayed that, but you showed it as something that was more than just fun, that there were some mm, things to that he needed to sort out for himself, if I can put it that way. It would be so easy to make a harsh kind of Larry Kramer, if I can use that as shorthand, Larry Kramer condemnatory portrayal of it, which you absolutely do not, or to go onto the other side and just celebrate everything. Everything was wonderful. And you kind of strike a middle ground that has such a soulful vision of community. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Oh, thank you. Um, yeah, so I mean, I came of age in the 90s, and at that time we didn't have the internet really, we didn't really have apps or social media. So if you wanted to see other gay people, if you wanted to meet other people, you went to the bar. Like, it was a lot of fun then. I mean, I do remember it being a lot of fun. I remember the music being great. I remember dancing. I remember meeting people. I met some of my boyfriends in bars. I met some of my best friends in bars, and that doesn't necessarily exist, I don't think, as much anymore. I think there are other ways in which queer people can kind of find each other now. But back then it was just like, for instance, like it's Thursday night, you know where you have to go. Like, like and then you'd take your time, you'd get ready, you'd go out, and then you'd have your night, right? And so yes, I mean, when I think about it, bars to me, I guess, like as settings, like, I mean, now you see things like Heartstopper, and all this is happening in school, right? Like, and that's the setting. But like for me, like it felt like this was a delayed adolescence for a lot of people too. So the bar is where we were having our teenage years, our real teenage years, where we were just making mistakes or being irresponsible or having a good time and not really thinking about the consequences. And so I look back on that time fondly, I have to say, though. Community is really important, I think, for me, and I talk about that more in family way, like in terms of like how we as queer people find each other. Like when you're born, you learn your family's traditions, right? You learn your family's culture, you learn where you're from. But like as a queer person, you don't get that when you're born. You're not taught that in school necessarily. You're not taught that in your family. You have to seek that out, and then you're taught that by your community. You're taught about Stonewall, or you're taught about certain things like, you learn that through your community. Even things like music. We talked about Boys in the Band, right? Like, I learned about Boys in the Band because someone's like, you have to watch this with me, right? And I think that is really special to me. And that is something that I really wanted to show, especially in the family way, like how we pass along our culture to each other when we're not born into that family.
This will be a transitional question to move in
Okay.
to bridge your first novel with your second, The Family Way. And I want to ask it in a way that is not asking you to give me a list of things that are true in your own life that show up in these books. So that's not what I'm asking. But I'd like you to say something more interesting than that about writing about a community and writing about characters that are very much relatable and presumably were in large degree to you personally.
Yeah. My books, like, we do get a question often as a writer, like, are your books autobiographical? Like, what is true, what's not? I know you didn't ask that, but what the way that I tend to answer sometimes with this is that I feel like its spirit is like the spirit of these books are autobiographical. I've only written two books. Both main characters are gay men who are not dissimilar to myself. Some of the things that I've experienced in my life are the things that happen in this book, but some of them aren't. Some of them are things that came to me naturally, as you write. Some of them are things that have happened to friends or lovers or family members that have just inspired me, and I've wanted to kind of shape and change because it just worked so well with the plot. I think for me, I think that helps me with authenticity. I feel like, to really get into the head of someone like Will, and like these are both first person narratives too, right? In order to be able really to get into their head, I'm accessing my own kind of thoughts. I'm accessing my own kind of memories. And I don't know if I could ever write a book from a completely different point of view, like meaning like, I'm not going to write necessarily a mystery or a fantasy novel where I had to kind of completely create the world and the characters. I'm not so much interested in that. I'm kind of more interested in chronicling what I see around me in my community, what I see around me as a gay man living in contemporary society. At least that's what my current interests are. Who knows if it'll always be that way, but for now, that's definitely what I'm setting out to do.
I think I have maybe two more transitional
Sure.
questions. The other one is about your writing. Whenever I try to talk about the effect that your books have on me, so you've heard me say this before on my channel, there is a deceptively plain, a deceptive plainness, a deceptively plain style to your prose that just has a cumulative power where where at first I'm thinking, wow, every little thing this character thinks or does is just kind of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then by the page three, it's like, oh my God, I'm so deeply immersed in this character's life. I don't know what my question is, Christopher, but to riff on that for a while because it's a really
Sure.
quite a signature style, I would say.
Well, that's really sweet to hear because you want your characters to be believable. You want them to feel like they're real people and they're friends and that you'll miss them when they're gone. I spent a lot of time with these people myself, like meaning like as I write it, and writing is so much of writing is rewriting. I've probably rewritten these books countless times, and as you go over it, like I'll reread it, right, and I'll reread it, and I'll reread it, and I'll get to these things that feel like speed bumps. Like I'm like, okay, that word doesn't work, this sentence doesn't work, and it gets to the point where I read it and it feels smooth to me. Like it makes sense. Like it makes sense that seeing this would trigger this thought that then would lead into here and to here. And I need to get to here at this point because I need Will to make that recollection about his mom. So how do I get from here to there? And I guess that's how I do it. I don't really know if I set out to do it purposefully, like, but these are the words that come to me. They fall in the right place. It's like Tetris. It's like this goes here, this goes here, this goes here. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't give enough description here. How, what can I do to kind of get that going? And then I'll try a couple of things like, great. I try not to do too much description. For me, I'm not a huge fan of things that are like overly written. I like a bit of a spare prose. I want you to read the page and kind of not realize you're reading it, if that makes sense. Like I want you to kind of feel like you got to the end of the page and you're like, how did I read this, or how did I read this chapter in 10 minutes or in 15 minutes? Like it felt like nothing because I don't know. I've come up against books sometimes where I read the same paragraph over and over and over again because like I can't
And
for some reason
focus
and it's
on it.
beautiful prose. It might be written perfectly, but for some reason it's not flowing. And so for me, that flow, I guess, is maybe I'll call it flow because these are both first person narratives. The flow is the mental process of my main character.
In setting up the family way and starting to tell us about Paul, you've already talked about how Will in the geography of Pluto wasn't so much connected to a community of friends. He had Angie, but he wasn't connected with a group of gay men the way Paul is. And so it's a very different kind of story. And your protagonist, Paul, is on the verge of 40, right? So talk about that evolution in terms of what you've
Sure.
already said about Will and to introduce us to Paul.
Yeah. So Geography of Pluto was my first book. It took a long time to write. I would say it's a heavy book. Like, it definitely deals with a lot of darkness, personal darkness, and darker themes. And then when you're done with it, I'm like, when I'm done with it, I'm like, okay, what do I want to write next? And I knew I wanted to write something that was fun. Not that Geography of Pluto wasn't fun, but I wanted to write something that was a little bit more funny, that had moments of levity, that was maybe not as dark as, let's just say, as Geography of Pluto. And I wanted to write something that celebrated gay male friendship. Growing up, a lot of the books that I read, for instance, I loved the Tales of the Cities series of books. I loved Ethan Mordden had a bunch of books like The Buddies Cycle. I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. How's Your Romance, Buddies? Going to forget them all right now, but they're these wonderful novels that had multiple characters and it was multiple stories and storylines that would kind of come in and out. And I really love that. So I wanted to pay tribute to the friends also in my life who were really important to me. At the time, I was also, like Paul, asked to be a sperm donor by his friends. So in the book, Paul is asked by his friends Wendy and Eve if they would help him, if he would help them start a family, and he agrees to. So that's what the book follows. So it mirrored my own experience of doing this. And I found when I was doing this, the process brought up a lot of questions in my own life and a lot of reflections about what is a family, what does it take to create life when you're a gay man, what does that mean, what's the responsibility that you have, and even if you do not decide not to do that, what does family look like for queer people, right? And so that's my headspace going into it. I also knew I wanted to write about Provincetown. Provincetown plays a big part in this book. And I wanted to spend some time exploring that world because that world is really fascinating to me. I've been probably half a dozen times, and I feel like it's also such a great place to explore human condition, the lives of gay men. So I think that in part and parcel was like, for the next 4 or 5 years, I'm going to be writing something. This is the world I want to live in, and that's what I threw myself into.
And I lived in it for about a year. Well, in fact, exactly a year. Remember, I
Exactly a
finished
year, yes.
365 days after I started it and enjoyed every moment. This is more of a quip than a correction, but I just want to clarify that it was a couple of lesbians who asked Paul to be a sperm donor. So not his gay men friends. That was a different aspect of the story.
Oh, did
Sperm
I say that?
donations.
Did
You
I say
just
that?
didn't specify the
Okay.
gender.
Oh, sorry,
So of
sorry.
course Sean wants to get in there and make a stupid
Sure.
joke. Why don't we meet Paul and Michael, his much
Sure.
younger, how much younger? About 10 years younger
11
boyfriend?
actually. Yeah, 10,
11
11
years
years.
younger.
Different. So they're a
Um,
different generation.
they're a different generation. And so read from
Yeah.
the opening for
All
us.
right. So this is their first chapter. I opened the front door to our building and started the climb. I began the ritual, the call up the stairs. It's the sound of a dog barking, a hound dog, some kind of rar 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 noise. Sometimes, whenever I felt wacky or tired, I'd elongate the sounds, add a couple of barules if I heard Michael bark back. I don't remember how this started, this way to tell each other that we're home, but we've been doing it for months, ever since Michael and I first moved into the place. The door to our home was unlocked. I entered and one of the cats came running. Funny how they never react to my bark, I thought as I grazed Malone's head. Am I doing it that badly? Sutherland remained unimpressed on a chair nearby, looking at me with two suspicious eyes. You're not scared of me either, are you? What's that? Michael called from out one of the rooms. Nothing, I shouted back. Just talking to the cat. I took off my coat and shoes and dropped my satchel on the floor next to Michael's gym bag. I found him in our home office in jeans and a plain t-shirt, sitting at his desk and sketching in an old notebook. The room smelled faintly of pot. Hey, buddy, Michael mumbled as I entered, his focus lost in the lines of his drawing. Hi, buddy, I replied. Over his shoulder, I snooped the nascent outline of what appeared to be a boat. What you doing? Sketching? My questions turned into a yawn as I crossed my arms and rested my body against the wall, by the window, the familiar hum and smell of the room sedating me with its comforts. I shook my head to wake up. Here, sit, Michael said, and jumped up from his seat. He led me down to the chair with his hands and began to knead my shoulders from behind. I just felt inspired, he said. It was a good day. I got a job painting an office in Mile X. It's huge, going to be at least 2 weeks' work. I looked over my shoulder to Michael's broad, busy hand, cracked and dry, his fingers as solid as carpenter nails. Your hands aren't dirty, I said, but then closed my eyes and collapsed under the force of his grip. God, that feels good. We only discussed colors today. Michael dug in harder. Jesus, you're tight, he said, and with a gentle tug pulled the back of the chair from his desk and swiveled me towards him. He planted a hungry kiss on my mouth. What are you doing? Having my way with you. Michael moved down my neck, his lips pressing into the scattering of short hairs. I just got back from the gym. Nothing like showering in a room full of men to get you thinking about sex. I swear I flunked high school the year I discovered boys. I have to get ready. I'm not stopping you. I looked at the clock on the wall, a lime green monstrosity that Michael had shipped last month, along with a few other items from his parents' home in Moncton. It was late, but there was time for a quick romp if I wanted. So I relented. I closed my eyes and surrendered to Michael's touch. But as soon as I did, the thoughts were there, everything I had to remember. Before I forget, your mom texted me. She wants you to call her, I said. Michael stopped, but only for a second. Here I am, getting all hot, and you have to bring up my mother. Yeah, so that's their introduction to them and their life living together in Montreal.
That's just wonderful. And again, a similar set of quintessential DiRaddo elements are there: the humor, the sexiness, and the sense that there's something deeper going on between these two, and in this the story is going to explore. I adored Michael. I had a huge crush on him. He's kind of a bit of a endearingly lost soul is maybe not quite the phrase, but tell us a little bit about Michael.
Yeah, so Michael is from Moncton, which it's a little bit far from Montreal. Born into an Acadian family and lives in Montreal, and he's 11 years younger than Paul. At this point in the book, they've been together a couple of years. They're living together. They have two cats, which is just the symbol of gay male domesticity there, who they often talk to, of course, because that's what you do and in the house. And Michael moved to Montreal to be himself. He had a bit of a rough childhood growing up in Moncton, not necessarily accepted by his father. And like a lot of people who come to Montreal come to live their life as a gay man. And so when he stumbles upon Paul, he is a bit of a lost soul. He is a bit of a broken character, if we can kind of say. He has really traumatic things that have happened to him in his past that he's not completely dealt with. And thankfully, he found this loving partner to share his life with. But that's not to say that there's not going to be drama along the way or issues that will come up.
And Paul, a generation older than not only Michael but also Will from your first novel. I think he's one of the gayest protagonists of a gay novel I've ever read. He is so gay at every level of his
Yeah.
personality. Tell us about that.
Sure. There's a scene in the book where he talks about coming out and wants to be a professional homosexual. He just wants to be surrounded by this community 24/7. And that's something that I felt too when I came out. I wanted to be a journalist, and then suddenly I wanted to be a gay journalist. I wanted to write for like the gay newspapers that we have in Montreal. And like the character of Paul, I worked for Gay Pride. I got to work for Gay Pride in Montreal in the 90s and working in communications there for almost a decade. There was just something I wanted to capture within the character of Paul, this part of me and my personality that just, in the 90s when Ellen was coming out and yeah, like I said, Tales of the City was on television. And there was just this moment of gay liberation that felt so powerful to me. And I kind of, popped that all onto Paul.
What a rich character. He is a character that's going to stick with me for a long time. There was just so many facets to him, and there was places in this novel where I got a little bit frustrated with him, and it only lasted temporarily. And I was rooting for him. He was so complex that I never felt like I quite got a hold of him, which to me that is a good thing. Like I couldn't quite get him
Well,
as the reader. He was just so multifaceted.
Yeah, I mean, you want your characters to have growth and transformation, right? And I think, he is someone who has to learn, like, even though I have my other characters and we talk about Michael and Michael being lost and trying to figure things out. I mean, Paul is the caretaker, right? I think he has this role both in his relationship, but also in his friendship circle as being the one who connects. He's a connector. It would be very boring if he was, I would say perfect, like, but so of course he's frustrating. He does things that are silly and, I don't know, silly is not the word, but But like you said, you're reading it, you're kind of frustrated with him. You don't really understand. He can be stubborn. Maybe stubborn is the word that I'm looking for here, like, about certain things. But he's not set in his ways so much as he can be. He listens, he's malleable, he can change. I liked writing him too. He's who I want to be also, I feel like in many ways, like what I would like to be in my friendships, what I like to be in my relationship as well. Like I didn't want to create a book where people were backstabbing each other all of the time. I wanted to create like, like this is a family, and yes, they do have their disagreements and their arguments, and they don't see eye to eye necessarily on a lot of things, but at the same time, they are going to endure. They're friends for life.
You mentioned him being a caregiver, and that is a fundamental aspect of his way of being in the world. And I have a quote for that. Well, I mean, you have a quote. I have a quote from you about that. Charles says to him near the end of the novel, "But that's who you are, Paul. You need to be useful to people. It's in your nature. You're like the littlest hobo." I marked that one. That one cracked me up. I guess, do you have to be Canadian to get that reference?
I
I don't know
think
how far
it's
that.
available in internationally. Yeah. Oh yeah. So my sister-in-law, she's Japanese. She used to watch it in Japan. So I
Okay,
know,
okay.
I know, yeah.
So the title of the novel is The Family Way. And so there's two kinds of families, or maybe there's more than two, but the two kinds of families that I think are explored the most are one's biological family and one's chosen family, which in the case of Paul is his circle of queer friends, and in particular, a group of gay men. And I'd like to delve into that. We'll let the readers discover the rich exploration of biological family because it's very central to not only Paul's character, but also Michael's and other characters. Their biological families and the issues and challenges and traumas of all that are another whole novel within a novel that we won't probably have the time to talk about, but it's a rich aspect. But let's tell us more about chosen family.
Yeah, so Paul has two really great friends, Danny and Charles. Danny's a former lover that, we all have that sometimes, like didn't work out, but we work out as friends. Danny wants monogamy. He wants the white picket fence. He wants to get married. He's looking for the Mr. Right, the perfect person in a package. And then you have Charles, who is an older man, veteran of of HIV and AIDS, survived it. And in his later years, basically is finding that young men are starting to find him attractive and is actually having a very active sex life again. And they're kind of Paul's chosen family. He spends a lot of time with them. They go on these trips to Provincetown together, where a lot of drama happens. And I wanted to really highlight these types of friendships that we have as people, especially if they're friendships sometimes with former lovers, because they endure. Sometimes boyfriends can come and go, but sometimes when you meet someone who is got your back and is there for you, they become your family. And you travel with them. In some cases, you might even live with them still. And as I get older, I know that I'm going to go gracefully gray with all of them, and that gives me a lot of joy, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to think about that, to know that getting older is not going to be lonely. I think when a lot of us, when we're younger, I go back to like, the Will in Geography of Pluto, he saw his mom as being very lonely and living a very lonely life. And it's not something that he really wanted for himself. And I don't think none of us want to be lonely, and I think I wanted to create a universe where that celebrated the way that queer people can be each other's family in ways that are just as valid as traditional ways of creating family.
And Danny, I was often frustrated with him. He was kind of jaded. He had an on again, off again younger boyfriend, and he had a lot of judgment about gay culture. He felt he had been wounded by it, I would say, and had a lot of judgment about it. But there's more to his character than that. But he was very different from Paul,
Yeah.
and they
Some,
had
yeah.
respectful disagreements about all that.
Yeah. It's funny. Like Danny reminds me of a lot of the people that I met in my 20s, and even me, I would say probably too in my 20s. And then Paul becomes, me now, like, kind of like a bit of an older version of that. Like I think, when you come out, sometimes you have all these like ideas of what queer life is going to be like. And if it doesn't line up to what you expect, you kind of want to throw it all out. You just don't want to be a part of that. And someone like Danny was interesting to write because, well, one, he's extremely funny. He gave me a lot of like really great one-liners. He's like
Yes, I've got one to read here in a minute.
the fun gay friend that you have, but he's also not just a caricature of that. Like he's a complex person. I've made him religious, like he's a Christian Catholic, which I also kind of wanted to play with as well. We don't really see that a lot in books. It's just really fun to create characters that are very different from each other, and it allows you to contrast them in many different ways. You can explore topics, for instance, like monogamy. When you have characters who all think different things about it, you can really explore a topic through what they do and what they talk about.
Absolutely. And at a certain point near the end of the novel, during a phase of Danny's life where he's single, Charles recommends that he gets connected to one of the apps, the dating apps, and he rolls his eyes and he says, I created one a week ago, but deleted it the next day. Everyone on them is either partnered or looking for no strings attached. It's like an insane game of musical chairs where no one sits down once the music stops. I love that one too.
Yeah. I had
We
fun.
can't,
I had fun writing him.
I can imagine. We can't move on from this important topic, this important theme of the novel, without me asking you to please tell us about Alan.
So Alan is Paul's former boyfriend. I would say probably first boyfriend. It's no secret when the book opens that Alan is no longer there. Alan, is one of the people who we lost to AIDS, and I wanted to explore what it is like as a young queer person to kind of maybe come of age in the 90s and also kind of meet some of these people who have been fighting for your rights for a long time, before you even knew who you were. And Alan was one of these people in the book. Alan is someone who helps Paul get on the right track. So I mentioned earlier that the first gay men that I met weren't necessarily the best influences on me. And I remember struggling with the fact that, like, how am I going to find my place in this community if the people who I'm meeting don't like me or don't care for me? So I wanted to give Paul this person who he met almost immediately after coming out, to kind of takes him under this wing and does this sense of, provides this inheritance, provides this like information to Paul to kind of give him that basis, that fathering, if you will, in order to kind of help him become the person that he wants to be. And so it allows me to give that role to Paul from Michael. Like, from Michael to Paul is pretty much who Paul is to Alan. And, when I think about it, and it doesn't always have to be in sexual ways, but I think a lot of time in the gay community, we learn from our elders. I wanted to have that in there for sure. This idea of multi-generational exchange, information exchange, cultural exchange, being passed down from one generation to the next. So for Paul to be finally that person at 40 who's basically helping a lost, lack of a better term, lost boy, become who he's supposed to be. He still has this memory of his father figure, the person who, when he came out, was able to help put him on the right path. So that was a lot of fun to write too. And it's probably the part of the novel that sticks out the most, probably because it's set in a different period. Everything else kind of happens right within a particular time frame. But then there's like this chapter where we go back in time and it provides the backstory to Paul and where he came from.
And was something from the get-go about how Alan and Paul's relationship, it started really as a friendship, and then it became did it ever become a romance? It certainly, then sex entered that friendship. That was how I kind of experienced it as the reader. That is so, it rang so true to me. It also occurred to me how rare that is and how lucky Paul was to find someone like Alan. And that it's another aspect of the theme of this novel, which is that there isn't such a big difference between friendship and romantic relationship, or there doesn't have to be, which brings me back to Michael and Paul calling each other buddy all the time.
Yeah, my boyfriend and I do that. We call each other buddy all the time. I don't know why we do. It's just something that happened. We all have these things that we say to our significant others sometimes. And I like that. Like I really wanted to show domestic queer life also, right? Like this idea of like, you talked about it's the mundane. It's not all, I mean, there's room for spectacular novels about spectacular living, but some days you don't leave the house, some days, you go to work, you come home, you go to sleep, like, and I that might be boring to a lot of people, but to me it's not. Like, I think that's something, I think when I was younger, I would have loved to just seen, two people lying on the couch reading a book together, like, and I wanted, or even doing the dishes, making dinner, having our, watching television. it might be extremely boring to a lot of people, but for me, it just showed that that's what you do in your family. It's not all going to be trips to Provincetown. It's also going to be having to deal with the cat's constipation, right? Like,
Yes. And the only way that I'm going to allow you to use the word mundane in this conversation is if I then append the adverb deceptively mundane, because it's again going back to your style. It's just wonderful. What more would you like to say to give the viewers a taste of the lesbian couple who have asked their
sure.
friend Paul, a sperm donor, because that's also woven through it. And in fact, I would say, maybe just to set this up for whatever you want to tell us, that it's difficult for him to fit that into the rest of his life, it feels like, or it felt like that to me as a reader. And everybody from his biological relatives, his sister and his father, and his gay friends, they had lots of questions about what that was going to be like that he didn't know how to answer, which was I'm not sure tension's the right word, but it was certainly a thing that was kind of not quite settled throughout the story that just added another facet to the story.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think speaking for myself, growing up in the 90s, there were two things I didn't think I was going to be able to do. One was get married, and two was have kids. But now it's like you can do whatever you want as a queer person these days. So many of us do have families, or when I say families, do have children, I should say. The Wendy and Eve, the friends, again, I wanted to bring in this, how important queer women are in the lives of gay men, and I wanted to kind of have that connection between especially Wendy and Paul. One of the things I mentioned too, that I am a sperm donor, and I remember when I was starting to do this, I had so many friends having so many questions and wanting to know exactly what are we doing, how do you feel, what's it going to be like with this? And I'm like, I don't know the answers to these questions, and I wanted Paul to go through that as well too, because it does bring up a lot of questions. Like for instance, even in his family, he comes out, his father doesn't really have much of an issue with it. But the all of a sudden you're going to tell like your family who, all of a sudden I'm going to have kids, but they're not really going to be my kids. They're going to live, it brings up all of these questions and maybe insecurities and feelings. And I wanted to explore that, what that is like when you bring this news home to your family that I'm going to have kids, and I don't really know what's going to happen, right? So I wasn't sure actually at the beginning that I was going to go there in the novel, but it just opened up a door, and there was so much to say. And like you said, we could probably have a whole other conversation about it, because I don't think we see a lot of these depictions in popular culture. We don't talk about that as much.
Somewhat facetiously, I'm going to say, now, people, you know why this novel is over 400 pages. There's a whole lot of stuff going
Yeah.
on here. And believe me, when you get to page 418, you're going to be really sad that it has ended. It was a wonderful novel.
Sweet.
So Christopher, I have an announcement to make. When I read two novels by the same writer that I absolutely love, then they go up to that pantheon of my favorite writers. So you are now
Oh
one
my
of my
gosh.
very most favorite writers. Well,
Thank you,
thank
Shawn.
you
That's
for
very sweet of you.
bringing these novels into the world. What are you working on now?
I'm working on a family drama. As you mentioned in the intro, I'm Italian Canadian, and so I'm actually looking into my Italian Canadian roots, just exploring what it's like to grow up half Italian in the suburbs of Quebec in the 1980s. So this next novel is actually, it's a bit historical. I'm doing a lot of historical research, and it's third person. So I'm actually writing from the point of view of different characters. So something I've never really done before. I'm very nervous. I think if you read for these two books, you'll recognize my voice and my style, but it's not going to be as, like, I would say, overtly queer as these two books are. But it will be queer in some way, shape, or form. But it's still in development, so who knows? I could talk to you next year, and it'll be something else completely. Maybe I will write that fantasy novel. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Or maybe even next week.
Yeah.
If these things
True.
can go. Well, I can't wait for it. And in the meantime, for people watching, I heartily recommend The Geography of Pluto and The Family Way. And what a delight to talk to you at such length about them, Christopher. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shawn. Thanks for reading.